Before we use Zoom, how do people online submit their questions?
Through the chat on YouTube.
Okay.
So we are live on YouTube now. You can close that window for one moment.
Okay, so Zoom or YouTube looks good. Good.
Yeah, we're live. That's what it is. People find it.
Yeah. Okay. Looks like we are on YouTube, and so we'll go ahead and let folks start coming into the webinar.
Okay. Hello, everyone's starting to funnel in. We'll give it just a couple minutes for people to log on for our November 4th edition of Science on Tap. All right. Well, welcome everyone to Science on Tap Minocqua Zoom edition. Thanks for coming. My name is Carol Warden. I work here at UW Trout Lake Station. Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea conceived in 1905 that the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. And we just like to recognize our partners for Science on Tap, Minocqua, and that includes Minocqua Public Library, Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, UW Trout Lake Station, and our previous partner, the Minocqua Brewing Company. They're closed now, but we hope that in the future we will be able to host there again. Science on Tap is supported through a grant from the Brittingham Fund to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I just want to remind you that there are 3 ways to watch. You can watch on Zoom as we are here right now. And when you watch on Zoom, you'll be able to ask questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen, which we'll get to in just a bit. You can also watch on YouTube, but YouTube is not interactive, so you can't ask questions there, but you can hear in the Zoom. Both options have the links on our website, Science on Tap Minocqua. You can watch the event later as well. You could go to Science on Tap Minocqua and click on the Watch Archived Videos. And our recent archived events have an 8 to 10 minute short as well. And before we get into tonight's topic, I wanted to remind you of our next event, which is on December 2nd. And we will have Craig Werner, a UW Professor Emeritus, talking about the music of the Vietnam era. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, can everyone find their chat button on the bottom of your Zoom window? And please use it to let us know from where you are tuning in so we can have some interactive play here. Great. We have some viewers from Madison, Star Lake, Mount Horeb, Illinois. Right here at the Northwoods Wildlife Center in Minocqua. How great. Few viewers from Rhinelander to the Twin Cities. So we've hit 3 Midwestern states, 4, Ann Arbor. All right. We've got Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota covered. That's great. Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing. And this is also the place where you can let us know of any tech problems that you have during the presentation. You can use that chat window. So for tonight, we have Tami Ryan of the Wisconsin DNR to talk about chronic wasting disease in deer and other wildlife health concerns. Tami Ryan is the chief of the Wildlife Health Program at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the Bureau of Wildlife Management. She received her master's degree in natural resources and wildlife biology and management from UW-Stevens Point. Tami has been with the DNR for 27 years and in her current position for the past 11 years. The Wildlife Health Team's mission is to investigate, manage, and educate about the diseases and other health issues affecting wildlife to help conserve Wisconsin's rich wildlife heritage. Tami and her team have been integral in studies of the West Nile virus exposure and infection in ruffed grouse, translocation of elk from Kentucky and ruffed grouse to Missouri, investigation on PFAS in deer, responding to emergency wildlife disease concerns over COVID-19, bovine tuberculosis and RHDV2, rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, and monitoring and responding to chronic waste disease. That is quite the list of things to have on your mind. So we have a trivia question. We'd like to keep that tradition going online as well. So here is your trivia story about Tami. As part of the project to translocate elk from Kentucky to Wisconsin, wild elk were captured and held in a quarantine pen in Kentucky, which divided the herds up into 3 separate paddocks, all of which were pie-shaped spaces. Required elk health testing before transport to Wisconsin necessitated moving elk from within these paddocks into the narrows, the narrow tip of the pie, which led into the alleyway leading into the processing building where the health testing occurred. Moving elk into the narrows always and the alleyway required a large group of team members going into the paddocks and driving out the elk, likened to doing a deer drive in Wisconsin, but the animals are much larger and in an exclosure. So during one of these drives, a group of elk challenged the drive line and broke through it, and the stampede headed straight towards Tami. What happened next? A, Tami jumped onto the back of an elk and rode it to safety. B, Tami hugged a tree as the herd came crashing by. Or C, Tami covered her head, fell to the ground, and started praying. So you will see a screen up on your Zoom monitor here, and you can choose which answer you think is most fitting. And in a few minutes, we will share those results. You'll also be able to use the Q&A button to ask the questions once we get to that point. So without further ado, Tami Ryan.
All right. Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can you see it? Okay. All right.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this evening's rendition of Science on Tap. Sorry, it's not something that we can do in person, and maybe enjoy a beer or two. Certainly, I hope that you're all doing that anyway. So, you know, the science of wildlife health is something that's always fascinated me. I actually wanted to be a wildlife veterinarian, and my educational and career path kind of took me a different direction. I came into the wildlife health, the science of wildlife health in kind of a non-traditional way, basically through an acting assignment after being in the field for 16 years, working on wildlife management matters. I was invited to do an acting assignment as the wildlife health section chief, and I stayed. I couldn't leave. I loved it. The experience was awesome. The team was great, and so here I am 11 years later, and loving every day. It's just a really interesting and ever challenging profession to be involved in. So I'm really appreciate the opportunity to share what the wildlife health profession is. Kind of give you an overview. Certainly this is not all inclusive, but I just wanted to offer some highlights and give you kind of some insights into the wildlife health program here in the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So just as a little bit of background, the wildlife health program is within the Wisconsin DNR's Bureau of Wildlife Management, and it's a statewide program. Obviously, you know, we're responsible for and trusted the responsibility of caring for Wisconsin's wildlife management. There's 3 different statewide programs that are within the umbrella of the Bureau of Wildlife Management program. And so wildlife health is one of those 3 programs, in addition to the other 2, which also have statewide responsibilities. And as my introduction had an excerpt from our mission, it's this is the full mission. You can see, you know, it's not just about the investigation of disease, but it's also other things outside of disease and just education about health issues, as well as working with not just with sick and dead animals or wild animals, but also living ones and their care and treatment. So this is the wildlife health program, or our team. It's a team of staff, individuals that I'm super proud of. I really enjoy working with them every day. It's actually, you know, our wildlife health program is a program that's fairly more developed than, say, other state natural resource agencies are. Not every state natural resource agency has a wildlife health program. Approximately, well, it's definitely less than 50%. I want to say 26 states maybe. And that's grown too in the 11 years that I've been in this position, as far as new states taking on new programs and developing their own wildlife health programs. But I'm really proud of the fact that Wisconsin DNR has a wildlife health program. They've really invested in it, you know, having a identified unique program. And then all of these staff here, you know, some other states only have like 1 person, maybe 2 or 3. The fact that we have this many people on our team is something that I think is important to be aware of. And again, just kind of shows the investment, you know, that the agency has made, and certainly that's on behalf of and support of the citizens of the state. You know, we deal with wildlife diseases. We have, you know, veterinarian on staff, which is really integral. We have several specialists that focus in on diseases or captive wildlife. We have our CWD processing center, and I'm really happy to say that we just this year hired a permanent processing center manager, which is you know, hard to believe that since the onset of CWD in Wisconsin, we've not had a permanent employee running that facility until this year. And then also, interestingly, we have the wildlife damage program within the wildlife health team. So working with agricultural damage, say, such as, you know, by deer or bear. So anyway, that's an insight into the team. And then we also, every year, and just the work that we do, it's so varied and fascinating and interesting that this, for 5 years now running, we have an annual newsletter that we produce. So I wanted to share that with you, make you aware that we create this newsletter. It is on our website. You can just search under wildlife health, and the 2019 newsletter would be here, or be there. This is the 5th rendition of this newsletter, and it's really fun to produce. I'm really proud of this publication and the features, the work that we do. We often have a feature article. Sometimes we've had highlights on some citizen science. And we also started adding into it as well a wildlife rehabilitation corner, because we have some pretty cool stories to share through the interactions and collaboration that we have with the wildlife rehabilitators in our state. So anyway, so that's our newsletter. And And then, so as I mentioned, it's not just about wildlife health, isn't just about wildlife disease. It is about live animals. And I just wanted to share with you real briefly, a couple of situations where we were pretty integral. The wildlife health team was very integral to the translocation of elk from Kentucky to Wisconsin. We created a new herd in Jackson County, and we augmented the herd up in Clam Lake. We had a 5-year agreement with the state of Kentucky, and we brought in we ended up, after that whole effort, we released just over 150 animals in total for the two. Lots of legalities have to be covered with wildlife and interstate transportation, including the health of those animals and health testing. As well as imagine, capturing those animals, keeping them in quarantine. It was over 120 days each year. So we had to hire full-time caretakers. We facilitated the interstate transport, the actual hauling of the animals, and formulating how best to do that and which animals should go where. We had three livestock trailers that we located these animals in, and then continuing the caretaking in Wisconsin. Doing daily observations to assure that there weren't any anomalies or any concerns, making sure they were well fed and watered, and then ultimately leading to the release. It was a really satisfying thing to experience, releasing those animals each year. And then kind of a reverse effort as far as the direction of the translocation goes. So we also had an agreement with Missouri. We have a 3rd year yet to fulfill. It was going to be this year, but that was put on hold due to the pandemic. But we have an agreement with the state of Missouri to translocate 300 ruffed grouse to their state where ruffed grouse had historically resided, and they've been working on habitat improvements down there, and so to accommodate the grouse down there. And so we've got 1 more year to go, but that's also really important. Each grouse that was captured had to be assessed to assure that it was going to survive the transportation, because they are an animal that doesn't do well in being held in captivity for long periods of time. And they actually they receive like a bolus of to hydrate them for the ride, and they did really well once they got to Missouri, and with the release and such, things are really strong, and the flights were very strong, and they didn't lose any animals in the transportation. So pretty cool to be able to be involved with things like that. Also in the wildlife health program, we administer the wildlife rehabilitation licensing, and so which requires licensing requires an examination and a facility inspection, and it's our team, members of our team, that facilitate and administer those requirements. And then we also have, as I mentioned, the Wildlife Rehabilitation Corner in our newsletter. We've had consultations with some of our licensed rehabilitators about some circumstances that they might have been experiencing with animals in care, trying to kind of troubleshoot things and work together on towards success, which is a great thing to be able to do. And then also we have a Wildlife Rehabilitation Advisory Council, and we have rehabilitators from around the state, both affiliated either with facilities or what you would call your at-home rehabilitators, where they've dedicated spaces of their homes to for this activity. And so working with this council on a variety of things in regards to wildlife rehabilitation is also something that we enjoy. The science of wildlife health also involves responding to emerging diseases. And in Wisconsin right now, we're in our 3rd year of doing bovine tuberculosis surveillance down in Dane and Columbia County. This is in response to a dairy herd that had a tuberculosis and has a tuberculosis infection. And so it's really important to assure that that disease hasn't spread from that herd into the wild. And so doing the surveillance around that farm is an important part of that piece of information. You know, if in fact that transmission would have occurred, it's something that you'd want to know right away so that you can get on top of that and respond. So, so far in the last 2 years, we've tested just over 400 deer, and we have one more season to go. And to date, the disease has not been identified in wild free-ranging deer in Wisconsin. Another emerging disease that just came to light this year is rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus. It's something that pretty significant outbreak of that occurred in the southwestern part of the United States. And we put out these health notices and this informational flyer and created a web page and have done some proactive outreach with like the Beagle clubs and you know, things, audiences such as that, to essentially try to get ahead of this and make people aware that this highly virulent disease, you know, it could be really significant to our rabbits and hares in Wisconsin. And so having all the eyes and ears out there, you know, for reporting any sick or injured or acting oddly rabbits or hares is something that we'd want to hear about so that we can investigate that and hopefully get out ahead of any you know, disease, get out ahead of detecting it sooner if in fact, you know, and as soon as it gets here, if it should, and hopefully it won't. But if it should, we want to be able to know about that and respond. Another emerging disease that is SARS-CoV-2, which is what the common reference is when in wild and when in animals. For humans, it's COVID-19. So who knew when this COVID-19 hit that correlating with that was going to also be, you know, correlating to the human health concerns would also be concerns about animal health. And in particular, what's being found, and this is such a new evolving world of information and science, you know, we've had this, you know, this One Health endeavor, which is, you know, human health, animal health, and wildlife health, kind of the intersection working together. And, you know, we've had across the nation there and across the world, there's been reverse zoonoses. So humans that are infected with COVID are passing this on to animals, companion pets, cats and dogs, tigers and lions in zoos. And most recently, there's been, you know, detections in mink farms across the world, and most recently here in Wisconsin. And then, so working with this disease in bats too is another species where there's a concern about humans passing the disease back onto bats as well. And ultimately, at the core is a desire to try to prevent, you know, animals and wild animals, so bats and mink or mustelids and felids, wild felids, from essentially getting infected and then becoming a reservoir where they could infect and impact those wild populations, but also potentially serve as a reservoir to reinfect humans. So that's something that we're you know, trying to learn about and be engaged with. And there's a lot of what is it, sorry, I'm trying to think of the words. It's like the ultimate principle of just conservatism is kind of what's being applied here. In addition to those items, we also work with emerging contaminants. And so these PFAS chemicals are a large group of human man-made chemicals that have been around since the 1950s. You know, it's in firefighting foam and the plastic coatings on food containers and plastic wraps. And in Wisconsin, and also I should say the accumulation of PFAS in wildlife is really unknown. It's kind of an emerging area of interest. And this started 2 years ago in the state of Michigan, where they had a firefighting testing foam testing facility where they had really high levels of PFAS to the point where it contaminated the water. And that, in fact, then they did a study on deer, and they found 1 deer out of 20 had a really high levels of PFAS, and they issued a health advisory to not consume deer from that area of contamination. Well, here in Wisconsin, in the county of Marinette, so on our East Coast, they are also a community that's experiencing high levels of PFAS and contamination of their wells, both wells and also surface waters. And they're very in tune to what's happening across the pond. And so as a result of that whole situation in Marinette County, the department took on a study to evaluate PFAS in deer in Marinette County in this known area of contamination. We completed that study this winter, and as a result, we did find high levels in the liver of some of the deer that we tested. We also tested 20 deer. And we found high levels in liver. So what we ended up doing was issuing a health advisory to not consume the liver, specifically from this known focus area in Marinette. We also, just in general, do wildlife health investigations on wildlife morbidity and mortality. And typically, if we get reports of 3 or more sick or dead mammals, or 5 or more sick or dead birds, is when we'll really launch into an investigation. And then the collection of any carcasses through these investigations and undergo a necropsy and then histopathology to try to ultimately assess the cause of death. So that's something that, you know, we have guidance for our program, statewide program. We get contacts across the state on a pretty regular basis about observations along these lines. And this is how we, you know, are able to determine and find things such as, you know, when even influenza is still something that we monitor for. But that's an example of, you know, or tularemia, or, you know, things like that, where, you know, we're able to investigate when we get these kinds of reports and conduct necropsies on those carcasses. And then we also do some research, wildlife health research, and in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, we've undergone an agreement to essentially do this regional study to try to assess the exposure to ruffed grouse populations and West Nile virus. And so we're actually in the 3rd year of that study here in Wisconsin this year. We created testing kits utilizing hunters who harvest ruffed grouse and submitting samples through those harvests. We also are collecting some samples through the reports of sick or recently found dead grouse to kind of integrate into that analysis as well. We have found that there has been exposure. We've had a very low number of grouse with actual virus, like in the heart, which would demonstrate that they were truly sick from the virus. Whereas others, the majority of which have had, we've detected it, but not to the point where it impacted their heart. And so what that's indicating is that they're exposed, but they're, other than the fact that they were harvested by hunters, they, you know, seem to be, you know, developing an immunity to it, right? And so, so that's good news. And really, ultimately, we continue to have a really good, strong, healthy grouse population here in Wisconsin. We're still considered to be the grouse capital of the world, and we have really great habitat here. And as long as we continue to be able to maintain that habitat, the grouse population should be fine. And then lastly, I thought I'd just hit on chronic wasting disease. I know that's a topic of interest, and certainly the wildlife health team here, the wildlife health program, is the homeroom for CWD. So all aspects of the disease that you can think of, from planning our surveillance efforts, which are different every year, implementing our field operations, assuring that we have consistency across the board. All the samples get processed through our CWD processing center. We facilitate getting all those samples to our partners at the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. All things related to policy, budgeting, staffing, the field operations, facilitating, coordinating supplies to undergo our expansive statewide efforts every year, all the training that we provide to new staff and to tribal partners, and then also the implementation of new initiatives. So we're starting in 2015, we started this pilot of the self-service kiosk concept, where essentially a hunter can go to this location whenever is convenient, and everything that you need is there to submit your sample. The tools to submit the deer head, the data sheet to collect the information, and then you literally just drop it in the kiosk, and then we come pick it up and get it processed. And so that was in 2015. We thought, hey, let's give this a try, because that's when electronic registration came on board, and we lost the in-person registration. So this is a way to try to fill that gap. And I can tell you that it's grown leaps and bounds. You're going from a pilot in 2015 of 7 kiosks to now 2020, and currently we have over 170 out on the landscape. So I'd say that's been pretty popular and pretty successful. So yeah, so the map on the right is kind of showing this year's plan, and every year we have a bit of a different plan. We're completing our sweep across the north, if you will. Those areas in orange are essentially where we're really focusing in on disease detection surveillance, trying to find the disease. If the disease, it's designed to find the disease if it exists at a 1% prevalence, with a 95% level of confidence. So we're really hammering into the northeastern part of the state this year, and then finishing out the northern district. This is year 2 for them. Some of the counties met the goals last year, and we're just finishing out the remainder of the counties this year. We have focus areas around positives in Lincoln, Oneida, as well as in Eau Claire and Dunn counties. And then those circles are areas around some focus around some known game farm, deer farm positives, and so essentially, yeah, wild surveillance, as well as surveillance around positive deer farms. Also, in regards to new initiatives that are facilitated by our wildlife health program, is our dumpster program. This is a management strategy, in that we know that the proper handling of deer carcasses is an important way to try to minimize the risk of disease transmission. Getting any potential diseased animal carcasses off of the landscape, because that is a route of transmission, either directly through other deer coming into contact with that carcass, or indirectly through the soil where the carcass has decomposed. So this is year 2 of really having information. Well, actually, it's year 2 of having an adopt a dumpster program. It's year 3 of having information at the fingertips for hunters, and where we have information now on our website that shows where landfills, transfer stations, and these dumpster locations are. And then some of these dumpster locations are adopted by interested individuals or organizations who want to get involved and want to help fight the chronic wasting disease fight. And so it's been a really successful program, and we're really appreciative of both the dumpster, the adopted dumpster, and the adopted kiosk programs. We've had some really great partners in cooperation. And then last but not least, and really proud of the chronic waste and disease research portfolio that we have. We also have this information on our webpage. Studying CWD in the southwestern part of the state, how it might be impacting mortality and survival of our Wisconsin population. We're also looking at forecasting risk as far as where the risk might lead as far as where the next areas of where CWD could be found in our state. We're looking into the persistence of the prion, which is the agent that causes the disease in the soil. And then also doing a study on composting as a means to potentially degrade the prion and address some of the challenges that we're having with some landfills not accepting deer carcass waste. So potentially that composting study could help find a solution to that challenge. That's a really brief snapshot into CWD, but I did want to at least cover some of the primary operations as well as our portfolio. So I think with that, that's what I wanted to share with you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Tami, for all that information. And before we get to the questions, let's find out what happened to Tami when this stampede of elk came running directly toward her. So the results of what your guesses are coming up. And Tami, you can probably see that on your screen.
I can.
All right. So I guessed that, well, I would have liked to think that you rode the elk. Maybe it's true. I think I guessed that you hugged a tree. So it looks like a lot of people did, and only Tami knows the right answer. So you have to reveal it to us.
Well, in a very astute crowd here this evening, answer B is correct. I indeed hugged a tree.
All right. Yes, I figured with all of them stampeding, they still probably wouldn't want to run into a tree. All right, so now we have some Q&A. So we will bring up some questions from our participants, and I will read them aloud so everybody on the webinar can hear them, and then Tami will have a chance to answer them. So the Q&A button to submit your questions is right at the bottom of your screen, right in the middle, and it says Q&A. If you bring your mouse down to the bottom of your screen, it should pop up, and you can submit questions right through there, and then we will collect them and ask them as they come up. So our first question of the night are, what are the responsibilities and duties of the wildlife veterinarian?
Good question. Yeah. So some of the primary responsibilities that she has is she's a chair of our animal care and use committee. That's one example where research endeavors that involve Wisconsin wildlife go through that committee and ultimately get reviewed for
We have a bit of freezing happening. Hopefully it'll pass. Okay, it looks like Tami might have a little bit of a technical issue right now, but hopefully we'll have her back in just a moment. In the meantime, all the participants could type in any crazy wildlife stories they have of their own that we could share with the group in the chat. Actually, if you put it in the chat, everyone will be able to see it. So that might be a fun exercise to do while we wait for Tami to reconnect. What What do I have? Actually, last night I went out canoeing on Man Lake here in Vilas County, and there's some pretty active beavers there, and a whole bunch of them, or it sounded like a whole bunch of them anyway, were slapping their tails at us the whole time we were out there paddling. So not as exciting as Tami's story, but fun nonetheless that we had all the beavers worked up from our paddle. Let's see. Certainly some of you out there must have a story. At least half of us have to have a story about raccoons getting into our campsite and causing havoc, right? Let's see. Scott Bovie says, we had a red fox on Kemp Station last week that was barking like a small dog. I had not heard that type of vocalization before. Are you going to tell a story from there?
Yeah, can you mute your microphone?
Yeah.
so that I don't-
Hi, folks. My name is Noah Laddick. I'm one of the folks here helping to organize the Science on Tap behind the scenes. And we were just having a conversation. So I'm an avid deer hunter, and I test all of the deer we shoot. I hunt down in the La Crosse area primarily. I do some hunting up around here, but my brother lives down in La Crosse area, and so I've got an opportunity to hunt down there. And obviously, there's some larger deer down in farm country than there is up here in the swamps in the Northwoods. And so they're in a CWD zone, not in a hot zone. But we actually use and have been using those drop boxes for the last several years pretty consistently. Every deer we shoot down there, we end up getting tested. And so I actually have to debone all of my deer out before I bring them up north, because you can't transmit carcasses across county lines, I believe. And so we end up just butchering our deer down there, deboning them out, and then bringing them back north up here where I live, and then dropping the heads off or lymph nodes. If we shoot a buck that we might mount on the wall or something like that, we'll go cut the lymph nodes out of the neck because we don't want to give the head away, since that's what we actually use to mount, but we'll cut the lymph nodes out. And then the other thing is we also use, they've got dumpsters down there. I don't know if they're the DNR supported ones. It's at a landfill, but they've got a dumpster down there, the same that she was showing as well. And we use those. We use those all the time to drop our deer carcasses off, just to limit. I think, one of their concerns is that if you throw it out in the woods, and you have a CWD infected deer, a coyote's going to pick it up and carry bones here and there and whatnot. And so it helps transmit it. And so I think there was a question of what does a process of testing a deer look like? And so that's sort of the background. We butcher a deer, we drop the head off. And when you do that, you fill out all the paperwork, including a pretty detailed reference to where you shot it. I think it's up to the quarter section, if that's what it is. You do the township range and then the quarter within that. So pretty detailed information of where you shot it, when you shot it, or where you harvested that deer when you harvested it, along with phone numbers and email addresses. And then there's a tag that you put on the deer that has a unique ID, and then you drop them in those drop boxes. And along that, there's just an online website that you get to go check out at some point in time. And most of my deer have come back within about 2 weeks. And so we won't eat them or anything like that until they've come back tested negative. And if they were to test positive, then we would just throw the meat out. And so we don't put a ton of time into detailed processing. We'll just, do a rough process of the deer. In the event that it came back positive, we didn't spend all of that time cutting all the steaks and things like that in detail. So we'll process those and do that. And then you can go online and check it. It's really super simple. It's super easy. I think it's fantastic. I even get my deer tested that I've shot up here in Oneida County where I live, just because I think it's a good idea. We know it's around. It helps And I see Scott Bovie also making a point that there's a drop box at Fish Hatchery Center on J for the local folks around here. And you can also use GPS coordinates. I think I've dropped my deer off at TJ Butcher Block as well. That's where they do it. Somebody else made a comment of, does it get stinky if it gets too warm? It gets a little stinky. But you know, most of the time in hunting season, it's getting colder. And folks, I think they come and pick them up pretty frequently as well. Scott says there's a freezer at Fish Hatchery. So let's see, can I think that, you know, basically how that does it. Can I get, is there any other ones that I could answer? If you want to talk, there you go. I'm going to mute.
Our other panelist helping here behind the scenes, Susan Knight, said that she has a whole flock of wood ducks coming up to her bird feeder. She lives on a little lake and they must be getting ready to fly. But that's pretty funny. They're eating all your bird food. That's really funny. We were also discussing maybe you have some interesting, sad, neat, I don't know, stories about roadkill. I know at Tree Haven down in Tomahawk, a UW Stevens Point campus, had a class maybe 5-6 years ago, and they taught people different recipes to do with some of the roadkill that happened. So people were making raccoon stews and porcupine pot roast, things like that. So maybe you all have something like that to share. I remembered in this time that about maybe 2 months ago, my sisters were visiting and we were coming back from Lake Superior. We went up surfing for the day, and just south of Mercer, we were coming back on Highway 51 here in northern Wisconsin. And we were in 2 vehicles. I had mine and my sister had hers, and she hit a bear with her truck. And the bear did not make it. So that was the tragic part, I suppose. But we called the DNR right away and we were able to get a tag. And I was involved in the butchering process of that bear that I have never had that experience before in my life. So it was a totally different ballgame than going through a deer. So it was quite an interesting story. We'll get to more of that later, but I see Tami is back. So oh, you're still muted, Tami.
Sorry about that.
All right. Okay. Well, we just were telling wildlife stories about some of the interactions we've had, and filled that gap while you
excellent.
came
I'm
back
sorry
to
I
us.
missed sorry I missed the storytelling. Zoom is not my friend tonight. So, but I don't know if I was able to cover the chemical mobilization. We were talking about veterinarian responsibilities, and so that was where I think I got cut off.
Sure. Did you want to finish that up?
Yeah, just, the use of controlled substances on wildlife is something that is, we need veterinarian oversight and licensing to be able to apply. All the training and oversight that staff receive comes from our veterinarian. She's also very much involved in our chronic wasting disease. She's leading our bovine tuberculosis effort. Those are just some of the thoughts that come to mind.
Okay. Another question we have is, do you have any influence on legislation that would benefit wildlife, such as getting rid of lead ammunition and tackle that leads to the poisoning of eagles, loons, swans, etc.?
That's a good question. We certainly our current administration is very concerned about the use of lead and the impacts that it may have on wildlife and the environment. We've recently just like this spring, we did have questions at the spring hearing on lead ammunition. transitioning to non-toxic ammunition. So trying to gauge the public support for those ideas is something that just transpired this spring. We're back to providing demonstrations on the use of copper bullets, which is something that was initiated within the wildlife health program as well. We had a lead action plan under the Matt Frank administration, and some of it carried through the STEP administration, and it's kind of coming back to the forefront again under the Cole administration. So, but as far as legislation, that too is something that's kind of ebbed and flowed as far as our agency. You know, as a state agency, there's been some philosophy that in the past anyway, where it's not our job to make the law, it's our job to enforce it. However, that philosophy has changed. It's kind of ebbed and flowed again to now where we've had opportunity to put forward rule proposals. And so that in part is, you know, what the spring hearing does. And so there is a opportunity once a year to offer proposals for legislation as well. So but that's a tough one, but it's certainly something that our agency is interested in.
All right, thanks. How big of a problem is hemorrhagic disease in deer, and does it spread quickly among the populations?
It's a pretty, so hemorrhagic disease in deer, we've had a few scenarios. We had one this year, and then we had one last year, a small outbreak. So it's certainly impactful for those local areas. We haven't had like a statewide impact where, say, some of the states in the Southeast have had. That's kind of more where the disease seems to be have a stronger hold, and also as far as influence or geographic distribution. Deer over time, they do develop an immunity response to it. And so in those areas where it's been more historically, deer are surviving better, right? But it's always when it comes to a new location, the deer are naive. And they don't have that immune response. And so here in Wisconsin, you know, we haven't had a statewide level outbreak. All of our outbreaks have been very localized. And so it hasn't really had an impact on a population as a whole, but I certainly would not discount the fact that it can have impacts locally. But again, even here, those small outbreaks have been, you know, in the hundreds of deer, not thousands. So,
Okay.
and it's something that they can quickly recover from as well.
All right. Could you name 2 cool wildlife diseases that don't make the front page of the papers?
Oh my goodness. I think I have this image in my mind of a turkey with like its head completely covered in like lesions, right? And so lymphoproliferative disease is something that can be pretty impactful to populations, and the impact that it has on the animal. It just kind of like thinking Halloween is just just behind us, right? And it's kind of this kind of grisly appearing turkey. It's really unfortunate for them, but it's kind of at the same time, you know, it's kind of fascinating how that disease and what the impacts that it can have, just like the cycle, I guess, of the disease. Trying to think what else. Cool. It's kind of, I think you're stumping me because, you know, cool disease, it's kind of,
Right.
yeah, I don't know. Sorry, that's the best I can do.
All right. With the SARS-CoV-2 at Mink Farms in Wisconsin, does that fall under your management or under the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection?
Well, that's interesting. So mink farming isn't really regulated. It's not regulated by either entity. So this particular farm here in Wisconsin in Taylor County, what it brought forth with it was a kind of a One Health approach. So we had conference calls with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, our agency, and also the CDC. The CDC was on site right away, working with owners, working with them, just in their response. We then consulted with DATCAP and USDA on doing wildlife surveillance around the farm. So similar to what I said we're doing with deer and the bovine tuberculosis surveillance, we're doing the same thing in Taylor County in response to the SARS-CoV-2 and the mink farm. So mink farming doesn't really, so it brought forth, no one really has like ownership of it as far as like authority over the licensing of it, but we're all definitely collaborating and interested and involved in the response.
Okay. And one person says they understand that wildlife rehab centers cannot take bobcats, bats, minks, and other animals at this time due to concerns that they will transmit COVID to humans. Is there a way that they could treat injured or orphaned wildlife and test them for COVID before being released? Maybe multiple tests before release?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So yeah, our concern is the potential transfer of COVID. An asymptomatic or non-symptomatic human could be carrying COVID-19 and could interact with any of those species and unknowingly infect them and then potentially release them back into the environment, and then they could spread it into that wild population or be a reservoir for human infection down the road. So it's the ultimate conservation principle, by not allowing the rehabilitation of those species at this time. Completely understand the question about could you test them before releasing them? So I keep talking about this One Health effort, and there's these monthly calls that we participate in. And right now, because of the limitations in testing supplies, and they're really, and it also testing of animals requires a coordinated response and approval by the state veterinarian, which actually is a DATCAP employee. So it has to be like this consultation between the veterinarians, medical experts in those three arenas, human health, wildlife health, and domestic animal health, to ultimately decide whether or not an animal should be tested. And so it's a really restricted ability to be able to test animals before they can be released, and they're really restricting it to only threatened and endangered species.
As a follow-up to that, are there other animals besides mink that are susceptible to COVID?
Well, so we're not really sure. We think, because of what we know or what's been found so far about domestic, dogs, cats, so the tigers and lions. So we, again, to ultimate conservation principle is to, we're kind of extrapolating that to wild felids. There's not yet been any evidence that they are susceptible, but the fact that tigers and lions and house cats is enough of a concern right now that this has kind of hit the pause button, and let's wait and see what we learn. It is such a new experience on all fronts, both human health and animal health. And there's people working hard on this weekly, monthly research ongoing. So hopefully we'll get some more answers here in the future.
Are tick-borne diseases a common cause of disability or death in Northwoods wildlife?
Not so much. We haven't really found that to be true.
Interesting. I felt the heat myself. Are there diseases that use several different species to complete their life cycle, similar to Lyme disease with ticks and mice, etc.?
Can you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Sure. Are there diseases that use several different species to complete their life cycle, such as Lyme disease or maybe swimmer's itch or things like that that they need more than one host?
Oh, that's a good question. So yeah, Lyme disease is definitely the classic. Yeah, everything I'm thinking of is like a direct connection. I can't think of, it really seems to be that tick cycle and Lyme disease. I think that's probably the best example.
Okay. Could you cite one major reason for Wisconsin's grouse population decline?
Well, in part, it's a natural cycle. The grouse populations are naturally cyclic, and so they have their highs and their lows. But that said, it could be further precipitated. One thing that's kind of interesting is some of the research that's being done with climate change and the impacts that climate change may be having on grouse is an area of study. And in particular, with the snow, the fact that winters have not been producing really that deep snow or holding that deep snow for long periods of time. And grouse are known to roost in the wintertime in the snow. And if the snow isn't deep enough for them to roost, then if they survive that winter, they're coming out of the winter probably in less vigor, less good physical condition, that they may not survive much longer, or they may not breed, or their breeding production might be lower than what it would be if they were healthier in a healthier physical state. So climate change and snow impacts of snow is something too that may be driving that decline.
So snow is good for a multitude of reasons.
Yes.
Hear that, friends? Let it snow. I see deer bait sold regularly. What are the current regulations on baiting deer and the fines for violating them?
Well, baiting, even though there are restrictions in Wisconsin on baiting and feeding, certainly the sale of bait and feed is not illegal. So even though there are areas in the state where you can't bait or feed deer, it doesn't preclude it from being sold. That said, the rule is wherever CWD is detected, either in the wild or in captivity, that county gets pulled into a ban. And then you draw a 10-mile radius circle around where that positive animal was. And if it encounters or intersects an adjacent county, even if it just nicks the corner of it, it pulls that full county into that ban. So as a result of that, we've got quite the patchwork across the state of counties that have baiting and feeding bans in place.
Got it.
I don't know what the fines are for baiting and feeding. So sorry.
Since the wolf was delisted this week and back under state management, are there specific wildlife health issues that you will monitor within the Wisconsin wolf population?
Yeah, so one thing that was kind of put on the side was the update to the Wisconsin's wolf management plan. And that was because of the fact that it was listed. Now that it's delisted, the effort to put into that plan and bring that across the finish line will get reinvigorated. And so that will include all of our species management plans include a section on health. And so we'll be drafting that section on what health, kind of just background, usually have information about background on health, but also, disease of interest or concern. So right now, we will conduct necropsies on wolves, things like heartworm, mange, distemper, those are the types of classic kind of things that you would think about when it comes to canids. so certainly those are, would expect those to carry forward and be of interest, and potentially others too. Time will tell, I guess, once we really sit down and start putting pen to paper.
To dovetail that, a participant said, I heard that wolves on Isle Royale became sick and most of them died. What are they doing to ensure the newly relocated wolves stay healthy?
I'm not too involved with that, nor are we here in Wisconsin. That's not, it's not something that we really are involved with as a health program here in Wisconsin.
Okay. Well, we do have one last question for you before we sign off for the night. If you were a Northwoods wildlife animal, which one would you be?
Oh my goodness. I think I would say maybe a fisher.
Fisher.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. You have to tell us why.
I kind of have a soft spot for animals that den, and I have a pretty cool memory of my first time I ever saw a fisher in the wild, and it was when I was doing my graduate research on the Chequamegon-Nicolet. Well, it wasn't called that at the time, but anyway, at the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, and we were standing in the hemlock grove, and we were doing our habitat kind of plot measurements, and I had a young student assistant with me, and we heard this rustling in the woods, and she's like, "Oh, look, it's a squirrel." And I said, "No, it's a fisher." And then we watched it, and it kind of like, it didn't even like really know we were there. It just like meandered its way in front of us, and then it climbed up this hemlock tree, and then just continued to hop from treetop to treetop in the top of the hemlocks, and it was so cool to see. I love that. A boreal kind of lifestyle that they have, and
Yeah.
And just that experience in itself. Just I would love to live in a hemlock grove if I was a wild animal.
I feel you there. That's a great story. Well, thank you so much to Tami Ryan. Thanks to everyone who participated, especially everyone who wrote in for questions. And thank you to our sponsors, the Lakeland Badger chapter of the UW Alumni Association, Minocqua Public Library, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, and UW Trout Lake Station, and our funding source, the Brittingham Foundation. Remember, our next Science on Tap is December 2nd, right here on Zoom, and we will have Craig Werner talking about the music of the Vietnam era. And if you want to sign up for email reminders or events, you can go to our website, Science on Tap Minocqua, and click Contact Us and leave your email address. And we will see you next month. Thanks.